What's up, guys? Alexander here with Date Psychology. So, today I want to talk to you about assortative mating. We're also going to talk about something called the D factor, a positive manifold of desirability. But first, let's talk a little bit about assortative mating, what that is, an explanation, because some of you don't know. That seems to be perhaps common. Some of you will, some of you won't. Let's go to the slide here. So, some discourse on this from the red pill. You probably recognize Rollo here. Does not seem to believe that assortative mating is real. Lots of tweets like this. Here's an example. Assortative mating was debunked in the early 2000s. It seems like it should be the case in a pre-sexual revolution world, but since hormonal birth control put women into unilateral control of reproduction, we can see hypergamy is their natural default setting. So, kind of gibberish. Doesn't seem to understand what assortative mating is, or hypergamy for that matter. But whatever the case may be, probably a good example of why you should not be listening to podcasters about evolutionary psychology. Really try to listen to psychologists. What is the reality surrounding assortative mating? Going on here to the next slide. It is one of the more replicable observations in evolutionary psychology. No one, to my knowledge, has ever found that it's been debunked. This early 2000s, it's been debunked, made up entirely. No one's ever said it's debunked. Not one evolutionary psychologist, any psychologist for that matter that I know of. It's very robust observation across human physical and behavioral traits. So we see assortative mating both for physical traits and for personality traits, psychological traits, behavioral traits, okay? This is also an observation that's very, very robust across non-human animals. So we see assortative mating across all of the mammals, for example, and many non-mammals as well. It is probably as close to a law as something gets in psychology. Obviously, there are some exceptions, but typically this is kind of the dominant mating pattern. It's what you see more often than not. So, going on to the next slide, what is it? If you don't know, you're probably wondering, what the hell is he talking about? What is assortative mating? Simply, assortative mating is the selection for similar phenotypes, right? Like attracts like. It is the selection of partners, mates, who are similar to yourself. Similar in what way? They're similar in physical traits, such as height, physical attractiveness. They're similar in psychological traits, personality traits, like the big five or whatever. They're similar in behavioral traits. You can think of something like hobbies or educational level or income or the type of job that you have. Whatever the case may be, we tend to see assortative mating across all of these. Individuals who have similar phenotypes, they mate more frequently with one another than you would expect from random mating. So, we know that mating is typically not random, and more often than not, it's also not disassortative. So, what is an example of that? Disassortative versus assortative. Think about physical attractiveness, okay? And actually, I'll give you an example of this in the upcoming slide. Let's just get to that first. Let's talk about the mechanisms of assortative mating here in the next slide first, okay? One is choice or preference. Why is it, we're asking here, the mechanisms. Why is it that we see people who are similar tending to pair up with other people? There can be different reasons for this, right? So that's what we're looking at here. Mechanisms, the reasons that this emerges. Choice or preference, okay? Phenotypic assortment here. We see people who are similar to us and we like them more. We know, for example, there's a familiarity effect. We like things that are more familiar to us. You know, we select partners who look like our parents in some extent, who behave like them as well. There is an effect of similarity where we like individuals who are similar to us more than individuals who are dissimilar. Race is probably a good example of that. And thus we pick partners who are similar because we like them more. Choice or preference. We also see convergence, and this is not something that's as evident in initial mate choice. This is something that produces assortative mating after mate choice, okay? This is how a shared environment shapes similarity over time. So imagine two people pick each other, they get married, they live together for 20 years. All of those shared experiences, the shared food that they eat, the way they live their lifestyle, that's going to make them more similar, okay? But that's kind of off to the side of mate choice, isn't it? Then we have social homogamy. And what is that? That in social groups, humans are a very social animal, right? Similar people live together in groups. Similar people live in similar environments. And this means that your pool of available mates is also similar. So if you go to school, you're at a university, we see assortative mating for education. It's pretty high, right? The correlation there is like 0.5, 0.6, something like that. You go to school, you're at a university. Everyone that you know at that university is also getting a university degree. So why is it that people with bachelor's degrees are more likely to mate with other people with bachelor's degrees? Part of that, social homogamy, right? Part of that, also preference, but we'll get to that. Let's go on. Which mechanism is it, right? So we've covered some of these different ones. We know that people pick individuals who are similar to them across not all, but many traits, and we know that environments or social homogamy put people into contact with one another when they're more similar with each other. The answer, of course, which mechanism is that it's all of them. Most often, the two at the same time. So for many traits, we prefer partners who are similar to us, but not all traits. We'll get into that in the next slide. Also, our immediate mate pool is presenting us with partners who are more similar, right? Because we're moving in the same pool of fish, so to speak. Convergence, as I said, that's a little bit different. That occurs post-selection down the line as you become more similar to the mates that you select in long-term relationships. Let's go on. Here's an example. Physical attractiveness, okay? We know that men and women both show strong linear preferences for physical attractiveness, and you can see this on dating app research. The more attractive male profiles and the more attractive female profiles, they get way more attention than the less attractive profiles. Certainly, people talk about this for male profiles a lot, the top 20%, whatever. This is also the case for female profiles. The most attractive female profiles, they get way more attention than the least attractive female profiles. We see, strong linear preferences, right? We don't see an assortative preference for physical attractiveness necessarily. We see that people like the most attractive options, basically. Nonetheless, we do see strong assortative selection for physical attractiveness. These correlations range between 0.25, 0.50, and typically tend to be at the higher range of that, closer to 0.50. So we see that people who are, have their own level, right, their own league, they tend to end up with partners in that league. That's one way. They're kind of bounded by their own attractiveness. Everyone is kind of shooting for a more attractive mate, but, they're getting people kind of at their own level. That's typically the rule across mate selection for physical attractiveness. People prefer very attractive people, but they tend to select or at least end up with people of their own level of attractiveness. You can even see this in friend and peer groups, probably with an effect size of 0.5. If you look at Cohen's effect size conventions, anything above 0.3 should be something, if you're a careful observer, you can see, like with your eyes. So probably you will even notice anecdotally, like you see groups of friends, all the pretty girls are hanging out together, all the jocks are hanging out together. We see assortative selection for friends as well, right? Just like we do assortative selection for romantic partners. You can see friend groups and you're like, wow, all those girls look like each other. All those guys look like each other. That's a group of ugly nerds. That's a group of hot jocks. That's exactly kind of what you see. So anyway, that's one example where social homogamy kind of is at play, right? Rather than preference or choice. Let's go on to the next slide. Another example, hobbies, okay? We very often see, people who meet in real life, they meet others who share similar hobbies. Men and women also prefer mates with shared hobbies and shared interests, right? So this is a stated preference. They like those people more. Those things predict better relationship outcomes and satisfaction. And sharing a hobby puts you into groups, right? Say you're a dancer or something, you like dancing. You're going to pick another partner from that group who shares your hobby. Now you have something in common that creates a bond. You probably have personality traits as a dancer that's similar to another dancer, etc., etc., etc. So here you see both effects of selection and social homogamy. Your hobby is putting you into a group with other people similar to you, but you also prefer people who have those shared hobbies or something like that. So there's an effect of liking and selection and an effect of the environment. Chance, who's in your mate pool? Let's go on now to the next slide. What about hypergamy? Kind of going back to these tweets by Rollo, who apparently denies that this very robust thing in evolutionary psychology is real. The two are not contradictory or incompatible. I can see why people would think that maybe intuitively if they don't understand them that well. So, I get it. So let me correct this misconception here, okay? A desire to select partners up from you does not mean that you will not see a correlation between traits in partners. So let's say everyone prefers a more educated mate, okay? You have some people that have a high school diploma. You have some people that have a bachelor's degree. You have some people that have a PhD. Because everyone prefers education in a linear fashion, who's going to be more likely to get together? The high school diploma and the PhD, or the bachelor's degree and the PhD? The bachelor's degree and the PhD, and that's what we see. So we're going to see a correlation for educational level, right? Even if everyone kind of says, I want to get the most educated person or the most wealthy person, and again, that's what we see. Income correlates between partners, right? More wealthy men, they pick women who come from more affluent socioeconomic backgrounds, much more even than selecting more beautiful partners. For physical attractiveness, again, we see the same thing, don't we? Kind of like I described previously. There's an effect there where you can only shoot up so high above your level. People aren't going to be picking down regardless of if it's a man or a woman. So you're going to see more 3s that end up with a 5. You're going to see more 7s that end up with an 8. And because of that, you're going to see a correlation, right, between, partners for physical attractiveness. So we know that people can have a preference where they want to have a more attractive mate, right? And hypergamy correctly is defined as, selection up for some kind of trait, most often selection up for socioeconomic status or income. If you were to say, hypergamy, the term is used, dating discourse, the manosphere, to mean whatever. People often use it completely incorrectly to mean promiscuity, because a promiscuous selection very often is a selection down. People, they often use it to mean a selection for someone who's physically attractive. I mean, that's everybody. There are strong linear preferences for physical attractiveness in men and women. So everyone is hypergamous if hypergamy means I want a hot boyfriend or girlfriend, right? But whatever the case may be, there's no contradiction between hypergamy and assortative mating, right? Sometimes people prefer to select up. Sometimes people prefer similarity. But regardless of those two, people end up with partners who are similar to them nonetheless, again, due to social homogamy in the case where there's no preference for similarity, and due to both social homogamy and preference in cases where there is that preference that exists. So anyway, next slide. We're going to talk about this paper. Again, if you think that assortative mating has been debunked, go ahead and go down the author list. This is a very recent paper in Evolutionary Psychology Journal, Evolution in Human Behavior, and the authors on this paper are pretty much a list of every, evolutionary psychologist who's ever lived. Every very, very famous evolutionary psychologist, they're authors on this paper, which is titled Assortative Mating and the Evolution of Desirability Correlation. This, I think, is a very interesting and important paper. I'm not going to go into a ton of details. I'm going to explain it, as I like to do with these things, in a way that I think everyone's going to understand. But understanding this concept, I think, is very important. Maybe it'll be a bit of a black pill for some of you guys. But I think it's important for understanding general desirability, both in the context of physical attractiveness and the attractiveness of all of these other attractive traits. And this is something that's produced by assortative mating. Again, a very, very robust observation for selection for traits. Anyway, going on, next slide, let's get into it. As we have said, mating is non-random. We know this, right? We know mating is assortative. It's usually not disassortative. It's almost never random, at least in human beings. Mating is assortative. So we don't select our partners randomly. We prefer some traits over other traits, right? Following, I hope so. We also prefer many traits that are similar to our own, right? That assortative selection for phenotype, right? Preference, liking. Now, following from those 2 points, does it mean that people with good genes or more preferable traits are more likely to select each other? It might. Think about it. We have certain traits that we like, that are kind of universally preferred, or at least preferred by a majority of people. And we prefer traits that are similar to the traits that we have. So we're seeing, selection, mother and father, where they're selecting for these good traits in each other. What's the implication there? Take a moment to think about it while we go on now to the next slide. The implication is that we should see a trait convergence, right? Convergence of desirable traits. Or in individuals, we should see that there is a correlation between desirable traits. When individuals have one desirable trait, they're more likely to have other desirable traits as well. Some of you will be thinking halo effect. This is not the halo effect. That's something different. Halo effect is how people perceive desirable traits in individuals that have another, right? So it's bidirectional, as I've mentioned in previous videos, the halo effect. If someone is behaving pro-socially, for example, individuals rate them as more attractive. If individuals are more attractive, they rate them as having better personality. It's kind of bidirectional there. But that's not what this is. This is an actual correlation saying, okay, individuals who are more attractive, they're also smarter, right? In actuality, it's saying that sort of a thing, So there's this positive manifold here, right? This correlation, this latent correlation, right? The D factor is what they call it in this paper, the desirability factor. It's a positive manifold of desirability that includes both physical and non-physical traits. Because offspring inherit desirable traits from both parents, you begin to see a convergence of desirable traits that individuals who are more likely to have, as I said, these kinds of good traits, also more likely to have these other good traits over here. So desirable traits will eventually covary in individuals. This makes a lot of sense on paper. This is also what we actually see. Let's go on now to the next slide. This is some results from the study. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details. I'm just going to show you this graphic, and I'm going to explain this was a very large sample study across 45 different countries. A great deal of variance in mate value, individual mate value, is explained by this D factor. The D factor is not just any other, specific trait, right? It's the latent variance there. So the variance here explained by this is about 0.4. So a great deal of variance in mate value is explained by what is essentially this overall desirability of a person, this latent kind of association between all of these traits. Let's go on now to the next slide. This is just from the supplementary data. I just wanted to kind of mention this and include this in the paper, because this is basically a huge list. If you go and you find that paper and you pull up the supplementary data, you will see just an enormous list of studies that show correlations between desirable traits, right? So you have like intelligence and openness, right? Intelligence and body symmetry, right? You have something like physical attractiveness and intelligence in men, physical attractiveness and intelligence in women. Actually, in men, it doesn't seem to be the case. You have one that says physical attractiveness and warriorship, physical attractiveness and hunting ability, physical attractiveness and social rank. You can just go down this list, but there's, a huge number of examples of how desirable traits correlate with one another. Again, as I mentioned, this is not just the halo effect. This is the covariation of individuals that actually have desirable traits. You're more desirable in one thing, you're going to be a little bit more likely to be desirable in all of these other things. So the main point here, this is from the discussion of this paper. I'm going to read the quote to you, okay? These results document a pattern of desirability covariation, D, that emerges across 45 countries, such that a person who is desirable as a mate on any one trait dimension is more likely to be desirable as a mate across all other trait dimensions. Importantly, scores on the D factor are strongly correlated with individual mate value. Finally, more than merely correlating with one another, desirability dimensions load onto this D factor to the degree that they actually generate cross-character assortment. So we see that this D factor is, a part of the selection process, this cross-character assortment. We see that individuals pick others who, kind of have this greater desirability, and this occurs across many traits. So let's go on now to the final slide. Final thoughts. What can we take from this? Obviously, there's an implication here that if good traits covary, individuals who are lacking in one good trait also tend to be lacking in a bunch of others. Kind of a black pill there, isn't it? If you're not tall, whatever the case may be, maybe you're lacking a bunch of other stuff. If you're not physically attractive, maybe you lack, warriorship ability or whatever the correlation was in that paper from the supplementary data. I mean, you can go down the list. Anecdotally, I've heard people say this, and it almost sounds kind of mean. I've heard women say this. I've seen them comment, and they said, yeah, it's always the case that the attractive guy is the good guy, or something like that. Sometimes these go against our stereotypes, where it's like, oh, the jock is bad, or whatever the case may be. I think those are kind of things, perhaps copes that we tell ourselves, soothing copes that's kind of like, okay, well, if this person got all his points in attractiveness, then this person's got all his points and brains, kind of like a role-playing game, right? Like you roll at the beginning, you get to allocate how many points to each stat. Real life is maybe a little bit different, where it's kind of like, this guy got the really good roll, and he's got, good stats and a bunch of stuff. This guy got the really bad roll, and those all go together, the bad stats and everything else. These aren't enormous correlations across all of these, but it adds up if they're all intercorrelated, doesn't it? That you're just a little bit less desirable in one thing and all of these other things. This might actually be why the halo effect exists. Because it's like, why is it the case that if someone's more attractive, we seem to think that they have a better personality? There's no reason that necessarily has to be the case, right? If that's the case, and if you go to the website, I wrote a whole enormous monograph on the neuroscience of facial attractiveness, and I talk about how this works specifically in the brain. Okay, individuals that behave well, that do positive, morally good things, they trigger the same reactions in the brain, I should say the same areas of activation that are associated with physical beauty. So beauty is kind of a shared area in the brain. Why though? Why are they not different? Why does it have to be that way? It doesn't necessarily have to be that case. If it is that way, it's possible, that it evolved that way for a reason, that we detect that. And that might be related to what's called heuristic decision making. Decisions and perceptions that we make that are often accurate, but we don't really kind of know how. Stereotypes are like that, right? As much as people are like, don't stereotype, it's bad and unfair. The accuracy of stereotypes, stereotype accuracy, it's one of the more robust and well-replicated observations in psychology. Often, your heuristic decisions, your gut feeling, look up Gerd Gerzinger, who's written a lot about the psychology of heuristic decision making. It's correct. And it's not the kind of decision that's like you can expound in your own mind and say, I don't know why I picked that, but it turned out to be the right decision. So it could be that the halo effect exists because we have kind of learned correctly, if someone is good in this way, they're probably good in this way too. Could be. Anyway. And finally, assortative mating, right? Very, very robust. Certainly never debunked. If anyone ever says debunked in like psychology or something like that, most of the time you should just ignore what they're saying. They're not really an authority on that. And that's the case with red pill podcasters in general, isn't it? When has a red pill podcaster ever been an evolutionary psychologist or an authority on psychology? They never have, right? Psychologists don't listen to them. They don't share their content. They don't promote it. What can be said? If you want to understand evolutionary psychology, research, statistics, whatever the case may be, you probably don't want to listen to random people, doing the modern equivalent of the Jerry Springer show. Anyway, hope that you enjoyed the video. Hope you learned some things. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, leave comments, all of that. I'll make another video for you very soon.